January 17, 1945. Outside Kielce, Poland, the frost came before the sun. In the pale grey of a winter dawn, Soviet tank commanders stood in a line beside their T-34s, arms crossed, breath rising in clouds above their collars. The air smelled of diesel and cold metal. Before them sat something that looked less like a weapon of war and more like a mistake. A Sherman tank, dull olive green, boxy and unremarkable. Its radio antenna jutted upward like a flagpole, too tall, too exposed. One of the Soviet officers tapped the hull with his knuckles and laughed. "This is what the Americans send us," he said. A steel box with a radio mast for the Germans to shoot at. The others joined in. The laughter was not cruel but weary. These men had fought from Stalingrad to Warsaw. They had seen the Tiger's cannon tear through armor like paper. They had watched their own tanks burn, their friends inside. And now the Americans, safe across the ocean, sent them these machines that looked soft, fragile, almost naive. The Sherman's armor was thinner than the T-34's. Its gun was adequate, but not fearsome. And that radio, always that radio, seemed like an invitation to enemy fire, a luxury no soldier could afford. One lieutenant kicked the track and muttered, "We'll use them, but we'll die in them too." They did not know, standing in that frozen field, that they were staring at the future of warfare itself. The Lend-Lease program was not an act of charity. It was a calculation. By 1941, Britain stood alone and the Soviet Union bled across a front 2,000 miles wide. Franklin Roosevelt knew that if either fell, the full weight of the Axis would turn westward, and the Atlantic would become a graveyard. So America became what Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States shipped more than $50 billion worth of material to its allies. Tanks, planes, trucks, locomotives, boots, canned meat, telephone wire, and millions upon millions of tons of steel. To the Soviets alone, America sent over 400,000 trucks, 13,000 tanks, and 15,000 aircraft. But it was not the quantity that mattered most. It was the philosophy embedded in every rivet and gear. American equipment was designed with a logic foreign to Soviet military doctrine. Soviet tanks were built to be expendable, simple, brutal, effective for one battle, maybe two. Crews were not expected to survive. Radios were rare. Coordination happened through flags, flares, or sheer proximity. A T-34 was a weapon, not a home. The Sherman, by contrast, was built on the assumption that the crew mattered. It had escape hatches. It had radios in every tank. It had ergonomic controls, padded seats, and a gyroscopic stabilizer that allowed it to fire on the move. It was, in every sense, a product of a nation that believed its soldiers deserved to come home. The Soviets did not understand this at first. They saw the Sherman's comforts as weaknesses. They mocked the Americans for coddling their men. But mockery is the first stage of fear. The German Wehrmacht had spent 4 years perfecting the art of armored warfare. Their doctrine was elegant and deadly. Locate the enemy, concentrate fire, destroy him before he can coordinate. The panzer divisions moved like scalpels, cutting through Soviet formations with precision. Soviet tanks fought bravely but often blindly. Without radios they could not adapt. A commander might spot a German flank, but by the time he relayed the information, if he could relay it at all, the opportunity was gone. The Germans exploited this ruthlessly. They isolated Soviet units, surrounded them, annihilated them. The Eastern Front became a graveyard of burning steel. Then the Shermans arrived. At first the German tank crews paid little attention. Intelligence reports noted the arrival of American-made tanks in Soviet hands, but the assessments were dismissive. The Sherman's armor could be penetrated by the 75mm guns of the Panzer IV, let alone the dreaded 88mm of the Tiger. Its profile was tall, making it an easy target. German gunners called it the Tommy Cooker on the Western Front, a sardonic reference to how quickly it burned. They expected the same in the East. But something was different here. Soviet crews operating Shermans began fighting in ways the Germans had never seen. Tanks that should have been isolated suddenly moved in perfect concert. Flanking maneuvers appeared out of nowhere. Ambushes were sprung with surgical timing. German commanders found themselves outmaneuvered, not by superior armor or firepower but by something invisible, by information moving faster than their own. It was the radio. Every Sherman had an SCR-50 radio, a device so reliable it could transmit over 10 miles even in the worst conditions. Soviet tank commanders, accustomed to fighting in silence, now spoke to one another in real time. They could warn of threats, they could coordinate attacks, they could adapt. A single Sherman, spotting a German Tiger, could relay its position to 4 others, who would converge from different angles, overwhelming it before the German crew even knew they were surrounded. The Americans had not sent the Soviets a better tank. They had sent them a network. The psychological impact was immediate. Soviet crews who had expected to die began to expect to win. One Red Army sergeant, Dmitry Loza, later wrote in his memoirs about the first time he commanded a Sherman. He described the interior as a revelation. The seats were cushioned, the controls were smooth, the periscope offered a clear view, and when he put on the headset and heard his platoon's voices crackling through calm, coordinated, alive, he felt something he had not felt in years of war control. In a T-34 you fought alone, he wrote. In a Sherman you fought together. The Germans noticed this change, though they did not immediately understand it. Reports from the front began to describe Soviet tank units operating with uncharacteristic precision. Panzer commanders who had spent years exploiting Soviet disorganization now found themselves facing an enemy who anticipated their moves. The frustration was evident in German after-action reports. One officer wrote bitterly, "The Bolsheviks have learned to think like us, or someone is thinking for them." Someone was. But it was not a person, it was a system. The Americans did not invent the radio, but they perfected its integration into war. While other nations treated radios as luxuries for command vehicles, the US installed them in every tank, every jeep, every squad-level radio operator. This was not accidental. It reflected a deeper American belief that victory came not from obedience, but from initiative. A private with a radio could call in artillery. A tank commander could request air support. A platoon could adapt without waiting for orders from above. The entire American military was designed to empower the individual soldier to make decisions, to act, to matter. This philosophy baffled the Soviets at first. Their doctrine was rigid, hierarchical, built on the assumption that orders flowed downward and obedience flowed upward. But when they climbed into Shermans, they began to experience something new: autonomy. They could see further, move faster, strike harder, not because the machines were invincible, but because the machines let them think. The symbolic weight of this cannot be overstated. The radio became for Soviet crews a talisman of survival. Soldiers who had fought in T-34s, where death came sudden and silent, now fought in Shermans, where they could hear their comrades' voices, where they were wet alone. The radio mast, once mocked as a liability, became a lifeline. It represented something the Soviet system had never prioritized: the value of the individual. And the Germans, encountering this new Soviet coordination, began to realize they were not just fighting an enemy, they were fighting an idea. By the spring of 1945, the Red Army was advancing on Berlin, and the Sherman tanks were at the forefront. The German defenses, once so formidable, crumbled under the weight of Soviet numbers and American logistics. Panzer units that had terrorized Europe now found themselves outflanked, outmaneuvered, surrounded. The Tigers and Panthers, magnificent machines, ran out of fuel. The German supply lines, already strained, snapped entirely. Meanwhile, the Shermans rolled forward, supplied by American trucks, fed by American rations, coordinated by American radios. The irony was lost on no one. The Soviet Union, a nation that prided itself on self-sufficiency, had been saved by American abundance. The Sherman was not just a tank, it was a delivery system for a worldview that said soldiers mattered, that coordination was strength, that freedom of action was the foundation of victory. Soviet veterans who survived the war carried this lesson with them. Some embraced it, others resented it. The Communist Party, eager to reclaim the narrative, downplayed the American contribution after the war. Official histories minimized Lend-Lease, emphasizing Soviet courage and sacrifice. And there was truth in that. Soviet soldiers had bled and died in numbers no American could fathom. But the veterans knew. They remembered the Shermans. They remembered the radios. They remembered the moment when the war stopped being a death sentence and became, for the first time, something they could win. One particular engagement in the final days of the war encapsulates the transformation. Outside the city of Seelow Heights, the last major German defensive line before Berlin, a Soviet tank battalion equipped with Shermans faced entrenched panzer units supported by anti-tank guns and infantry. The German position was formidable, dug in across a ridge with overlapping fields of fire. A direct assault would have been suicide. In earlier years, Soviet commanders would have ordered exactly that, a mass charge, accepting horrific losses as the price of victory. But this time, the Soviet commander did something different. Using his radio, he coordinated a feint from the center while 2 platoons of Shermans circled wide through forested terrain, moving silently, maintaining radio discipline. When the German guns opened fire on the center, revealing their positions, the flanking Shermans struck from both sides simultaneously. The German crews, trained to expect frontal assaults, were caught in a crossfire. Within 20 minutes, the ridge was taken. Soviet casualties were minimal. The Germans, bewildered and broken, retreated toward Berlin. This was not the Red Army of 1941. This was an army that had learned to think in networks, to value coordination over raw courage, to see the battlefield not as a meat grinder, but as a chessboard. And the piece that made this possible, the piece that connected every move, was the radio inside the Sherman. After the war, the Sherman was retired, surpassed by newer, heavier tanks. But its legacy endured. Soviet military theorists studied American combined arms tactics, dissecting the lessons of Lend-Lease. The T-54 and T-55 tanks that followed incorporated radios as standard equipment. The doctrine of deep battle, which had always emphasized mass and momentum, began to incorporate flexibility and communication. The Red Army had been transformed, not by ideology but by experience. And yet the transformation was incomplete. The Soviet system could adopt the tools of freedom, the radios, the trucks, the coordination, but it could not adopt the philosophy that created them. American abundance was not just material, it was cultural. It came from a society that trusted its citizens, that encouraged innovation, that believed the individual was the engine of progress. The Sherman was built by a nation that assumed its soldiers deserved the best, not because they were expendable, but because they were irreplaceable. The Soviets could mimic this, but they could not replicate it. And in the decades that followed, as the Cold War hardened into permanence, this distinction would define the conflict. The West built systems that empowered individuals. The East built systems that controlled them. Both sides had radios, but only one side trusted the people holding them. There is a photograph taken in Berlin in May 1945, of a Soviet soldier standing atop a Sherman tank, waving a red flag. The image was iconic, reproduced in Soviet propaganda for decades. But look closely at the photograph, and you see the radio mast rising behind him, slender and tall, catching the light. It is easy to miss, easy to ignore, but it is there, a quiet monument to the thing that made victory possible. The soldiers who laughed at that mast in the frozen fields of Poland learned, eventually, to love it. They learned that survival is not a function of armor thickness or gun caliber, but of connection. They learned that the strongest weapon is the one that lets you hear your comrade's voice in the darkness, that lets you know you are not alone. And in the end, that was the lesson America sent across the ocean, wrapped in steel and oil, and radio waves. Not that freedom is easy, not that democracy is inevitable, but that the individual, given the tools and the trust, can change the world. The Soviets laughed at the broken radio, but the radio was never broken. It was hot, and it crushed, not just the German defense, but the very idea that soldiers were meant to die alone, unheard, unmourned. The Americans had built a machine that refused to accept that premise. And in doing so, they had built a machine that won the war.